Well, thank you very much for joining the community information session tonight on the topic of coming to terms with death in spina bifida. And we're sharing this content today because many individuals with spina bifida have shared their concerns about dying suddenly. So today's presenters are going to address this concern by bringing up some things that could be done to reduce the risk of a premature death, but they'll also discuss the legal and personal issues surrounding medical decisions, um, and last rites, and above all, how to manage the very normal fears about sudden death so that it's possible to make the most out of life. But before we get started, a couple of things. If you are considering suicide or if you are in emotional distress, please call or text the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. The number is 988. That is a national number. If you want to learn more about the Lifeline, please visit their website. It's 988lifeline.org. And also, the material that you hear tonight is not a substitute or is not meant to be a substitute for medical advice. So please consult your healthcare provider if you have any medical questions. And definitely, if you feel like you have a medical emergency, please call 911. So my name is Juanita Panliner, and I manage the Spina Bifida Association's National Resource Center. And we're joined today by my colleague, Judy Thibodeau, who is SBA's National Director of Research and Services. And wanted to also mention that for today's webinar, you will remain muted. However, we definitely encourage and welcome your questions and comments using the Q&A and the chat features. And yes, everybody who's attended this session will receive a recording. And even if you didn't attend the session, you will receive a recording for those who registered. And eventually this recording will also be available on SBA's YouTube channel. And closed captioning is enabled. And so now I'm really excited to welcome and introduce today's experts. Karlin Bruegel, PhD. She is a clinical psychologist that practices in Boulder County in Colorado. And she offers diverse services to children, teens, adults, and specializes in the treatment of depression, anxiety, trauma, grief, adjustment and life transition issues, disability and chronic illness, learning with disabilities, neurodiversity, LGBTQ issues, and other issues. So, and Dr. Bruegel was born with spina bifida. And Dr. Elizabeth Scriven is a licensed psychologist in the state of Washington. She is a full-time instructor at Western Washington University, and there she also provides rehabilitation counseling courses to adult learners. She is also a clinical supervisor and clinician with a community health service in also Washington State. And she's worked in the mental health field since 2012 for people of different ages, abilities, and backgrounds. And Dr. Scriven was also born with spina bifida. So now I leave you and I turn the session over to both Karlin and Elizabeth.
Hello, and welcome to our presentation tonight. We're calling it For Whom the Bell Tolls, Coming to Terms with Death in Spina Bifida.
So because death is a fact of life, it's important to overcome our own thanatophobia, or fear of death, and actually confront it and come to terms with it.
So when it comes to disability and death, those who identify as disabled, having a disability, or chronically ill tend to be more cognizant of death and dying and their own frailty, because with our conditions, with our disability, we tend to interact more with the medical world. We also tend to have more secondary issues potentially that could cause death and dying. There's a lot of old knowledge still floating around as if it's the thing that's true and accurate around spina bifida in particular. We have a lot of new knowledge about spina bifida and secondary conditions and other things that may lead to death or may lead to longevity. So we have a lot of hope these days. There's a lot of new medical ideas and treatments for the things that potentially used to kill us. They don't anymore.
So, what are the common fears of death that are salient to people with spina bifida? Well, they include urologic disorders and renal failure, hydrocephalus or shunt malfunction, sepsis, gastrointestinal blockages and other gastrointestinal issues, Chiari malformation, tethered cord, sleep apnea, scoliosis, and epilepsy.
So Karlin and I both reviewed the literature that's available on causes of death in people with spina bifida. I will add the kind of the caveat that there isn't a whole lot. We definitely need a whole lot more, especially for adults with spina bifida. But the good news is that many people, if not most people, do not die of spina bifida and do not die of secondary conditions related to spina bifida. So in the 70s, the shunts that people are using today were kind of further developed and became pretty good at monitoring and managing hydrocephalus. And so with that medical jump in the 70s, now about 85% or so of children with spina bifida are reaching adulthood. And of course, medical science has come a long way since the 70s, and shunts have improved with that as well. 67% of the overall population with spina bifida now consists of adults. So there's a lot of us. In several of the articles that I reviewed, they were based on chart reviews. So what they did is they looked at people with spina bifida who had been hospitalized. They looked at why they were hospitalized and how many of them died while hospitalized. So these articles and this information that I'm about to go over is only in the hospitalized population. We could not find any current literature that leaked cause of death in spina bifida if someone wasn't hospitalized prior to their death. So keep that in mind. There's still some room for growth here. However, I found this information myself really reassuring because there were 487 chart reviews, so almost 500 people with spina bifida who were hospitalized were looked at, and only 48 of them died. So yes, 48 is a large number, but 48 is not that big of a percentage of 500. All of these causes of death were preventable to some degree, and Karlin and I are going to talk about that in later slides. So the largest, I'm not done. Thank you.
Sorry.
The largest cause of death was infection. So there were 7 people of 48 who died of infection. All of them were already septic before they went to the hospital. So that means the infection had already advanced to a state where it had gone from a localized thing of a urinary tract sepsis, a pneumonia, or a cellulitis into a general infection of the blood called sepsis. And so that was most likely the reason for death. Sepsis is one of those things that once you have it, it can be very hard to manage and get control of. 6% of 6 folks, or 12.5% of the folks, had respiratory failure of some kind. So 2 of them had sleep apnea. 4 of the patients who died had chronic restrictive lung disease due to their underlying severe scoliosis. 2 people, for about 4.2%, had end-stage renal disease or abnormal renal function. But abnormal renal function in general was not as significantly associated with earlier cause of death. So end-stage renal disease, people who are being treated by a nephrologist, maybe undergoing different treatments for their renal disease, and it's been advanced enough for long enough, was a potential cause for death. But abnormal renal function in general was not. So chronic UTIs, caffeine regularly, other kind of renal function issues, not significantly associated with death. Shunt malfunction, there were 2 folks who died of shunt malfunction, where the shunt just failed. And then metastatic cancer was also 2 folks. Both of those folks were later in life cancers. Neither of those cancers were related to spina bifida. So the takeaway here for me is that while not maybe 100% preventable, many of these issues can be taken care of or managed or prevented with good health care and preventative care. So yeah, good news.
So the news is good. There is hope. Shall I cover this one?
Please.
Okay. So most of these causes of death can be managed or mitigated in some form. And what it basically requires is daily self-management and monitoring of your health, taking care of your bladder and bowel and skin, and monitoring for symptoms, making sure to schedule and keep regular appointments with your providers, and making sure to come prepared with your questions and concerns to ensure that the different facets of your health are covered. And it's really important. Elizabeth and I will underscore just the vital importance of communicating with your healthcare providers and being willing to reach out if something is different or strange or unusual, or if you have a question, and not being a shrinking violet or worrying that you're wasting their time or being hysterical. You
My
ultimately know. Go ahead.
sorry.
I mean, you ultimately know your body best. So if you notice something that's outside of your norm, don't let anybody, even a provider, dissuade or gaslight you into not having that thing addressed. What was your thought?
Well, I was going to add, my rule of thumb here is if I'm worried enough to reach out on social media, post in a Facebook chat, or ask a friend to, hey, take a look at this, then I am probably worried enough to call my doctor or even go to the emergency room or urgent care if I think I need to, even if I don't think I need to.
Best to be proactive and to trust your gut. Shall I cover this?
Yeah, so before we move on all the way to this next piece, so that piece was about medical care and just kind of monitoring your own medical and physical health, making sure you're hitting up your appointments. I know I'm being redundant here, but I think this piece is important. So making sure you're following up with your regular physicals, any regular specialty care that you should be having, going with lists of questions for your doctors. Karlin hit that up. One of my favorite newer tools is to my chart my doctor my questions before I even go to the appointment. That way they
Yes.
even maybe have time to review them before I'm sitting in the room with them. And again, going and calling the right medical providers if I have questions about something that's happening to my body. If you have the worst headache of your life, go to the emergency room. If you have a red spot that keeps growing and is hot, go to the emergency room. Really be proactive for these things, making sure you're doing your body checks on a regular basis for the parts of your body you can't feel. Making sure that you're doing your pressure releases the way you should be from your chair so that you don't get pressure sores on your bum. If you wear AFOs or other orthotics, making sure that on a daily basis they're not rubbing and that you're checking those places where you lack sensation.
And scanning for all of the atypical and typical signs of a UTI, which can be painful urination, frequent urination, strangely colored urine, running a fever, and more. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about how do you prepare for death and let your loved ones know about your final wishes. So it just is this presentation shouldn't be construed as medical advice, nor should it be construed as formal legal advice. And to go into greater detail, you will want to consult with a lawyer on many of these details. So, and for more information on these things, you can go to the bibliography of this presentation, and the resources in the bibliography will tell you how to do some of these things or start that process. So let's talk about preparing your essential documents that will let your loved ones know about your final wishes, and also let emergency personnel and providers know about your important information, so that if that needs to be accessed quickly, they know where to find it and it's all there. So what is recommended is that you create a death file consisting of a binder with organized tabs and a table of contents, and to peruse and update the contents of this binder every year as appropriate. So what is in the binder? Uh, we'll, uh, we'll talk about that. So talk to your trusted loved ones, your lawyer, and your doctor about your final wishes, and let them know about the location and the contents of this file. Talk to the people you've named as executors, trustees, or guardians about their designated role and your wishes thereof. And then meet with a lawyer if you have questions or concerns about your documents. So what is in this file? It will contain and this is not a comprehensive list, but this is just a few of the items that it could contain. Your last will and testament, which could include your intended guardians for your children and your pets, who will get your important assets and possessions, and that document expressed in your will. You can have a trust that names a trustee responsible for managing the assets in that trust, if you have a trust. Durable power of attorney, which appoints someone to make financial decisions when you are incapacitated. A healthcare power of attorney, which appoints someone to make important medical decisions for you when you're incapacitated. A living will, which states your wishes for your end of life care and can include potentially things like a DNR, or a do not resuscitate order, or a physician orders for life for sustaining treatment, or POLST. So under what circumstances do I want to live, and under what circumstances do I not want to live or be resuscitated? A HIPAA release for people you want to be included in your medical updates and information, basically saying, I'm okay with my doctors sharing this information with these other providers, family members, or other folks. And a letter of intent, which is not a legal document, but it allows you to state your preferences with regards to your last rites, your remains, special items you want to give to people, and other matters. You can even state what you would like your funeral to be like, what religion you practice, any sort of details that you think are relevant.
Yeah, well, can we go
Go
back
ahead.
just 1 minute? Thank
Sure.
you. So I just kind of want to reiterate that none of these things are required, but they can
None of
all
them are
be
required.
helpful to peace of mind. So that if you were in a car accident or diagnosed with something non-SB related, or in an SB related emergency of some kind, having a power of attorney or a living or will or pre-signed releases of information could help you and your loved ones, your support network, be ready to take action and make decisions on your behalf should that ever be needed.
Correct.
Many times these things get put in place and they're not needed, right? Like you can put these in your place at your 20s and your 30s, and you might live until you're 60 and be perfectly healthy and never need these. But if you're worried about who's going to make these decisions for you, if you're worried about what's going to happen to your kids or your pets, having a last will and testament or a letter of intent can be helpful to your peace of mind.
And families can be torn apart, and there can be genuine chaos when these things are not specified. So there are so many people who do not want to think about these details. So they put it off and they punt the ball, and then something happens. And then their loved ones are often left squabbling over what to do, caught into paralysis, leading with their own personal beliefs or preferences, which may or may not reflect your beliefs or preferences. So it's really important to have the forethought and courage to address these things, and recognize that things can go really wrong. if you don't state, even in the absence of a desire, saying I don't have a desire in this regard is better than leaving it up to guesswork at the 11th hour. In addition to the aforementioned essential documents, your death file should include copies and the specific locations of your car titles, your property deeds, keys to vehicles, safety deposit boxes, and the like, and other important documents as relevant. So your insurance policies, your social security card, your records of mortgages, debts, records of stocks and bonds, names and account numbers of banks, your most recent income tax return. So imagine that you've been incapacitated and your loved ones or emergency responders have to go through and find some of this information in emergency or in the event of your untimely death. You may also want to include account and device passwords and may even wish to appoint a digital executor responsible for exercising your last wishes with regards to your online accounts and other digital assets. I think that's becoming more and more relevant the more we store online and the more our social media actually plays a relevant part of our lives and our identities and our social connections. Oh, you're muted. You're silent.
Ah, got to remember to unmute. So I just want to validate the feelings of overwhelmed. I am not new to this information, and just listening to Karlin talk about all of this and list it all out feels like a lot and it feels overwhelming. So if these things don't make sense, if you're like, I'm not sure this applies to me, please reach out to the people in your care system, in your natural support system, parents, siblings, friends, and ask questions. Not everybody needs all of these things, but some of this might apply to you. And I do agree that it's important to kind of be thinking about it, especially if you worry about what's going to happen when or if you should die.
Shall I cover this slide?
Why don't I just go ahead and cover this
Go
one and
ahead.
give you a break for a minute?
Okay.
So in addition to all the practical things that you can do around setting up your powers of attorney and your last wishes, there's also some really kind of behaviorally based things that you can do when you're confronting and managing the death of dying or the fear of dying. You can talk about it with a therapist. And if you don't have a therapist, talk about it with friends or family who are open to having those conversations with you. If you're finding the anxiety around it really getting in the way of your day-to-day life, I would recommend a therapist because there might be more there that feels a little bit more personal or private and may not be comfortable talking about with just anybody. Death and dying is not something we talk a lot about in our society. However, it is a normal, inevitable, and universal truth for all of us. Death is what happens at the end. It doesn't last forever. And I love pets for this reason. I think pets are a really great way to help talk about death and dying because most of us are going to outlive our pets. Turtles and tortoises may be aside because they can live like over 100 years. But our dogs, our cats, our hamsters, we're probably going to outlive them. And so can be a great kind of stepping stone, in my opinion, is talking about pets. When you're talking about death and dying and your beliefs around those things or your questions about those things, it can be helpful to reflect on your religion or philosophy of life and death. It can be helpful to look at some media. We're going to supply you with some books and some movies and other resources that you can watch and read and learn more about death and dying. Science and nature can be a great observational tool. And then a lot of conversations. There's an actual group of people called death cafes, and they meet all
Can I
over
promote the Death Cafe?
Yes, please do. You know way more about it than I do.
So I was a member of my local Death Cafe, and I think they dissolved due to COVID. but many areas have what is called a death cafe, which is just a group of people who often gather at the library or a community center or some other meeting place to just talk about death. And your local death cafe will usually specify that it is not intended as a grief group. It is intended to explore the different medical, legal, personal, philosophical, and other aspects of death. And I loved my local cafe because you never knew going in what the discussion was going to be. So some days it might be religion and philosophy and people sharing their opinions of, is there life after death and what would that look like? Some days it was people talking about illness and coping with illness and coming to terms with that in a personal sense. Other people would share stories about loved ones who were dying or had died. And other days we got down to the legal nitty gritty and talked about DNRs. So I would recommend Googling Death Cafe. I believe that there is a central Death Cafe website where you can look up death cafes in your area.
Cool, thank you. And then I love this one, the fact checking your beliefs, assumptions, and fears. This is my #1 recommendation for almost any anxiety somebody may have. But how is this fear or assumption healthy, helpful, or accurate? Our fear response or anxiety response helps us to stay safe. So if I'm fearful about crossing the street and I stop and look both ways before I cross, I'm going to probably stay alive because I'm not going to get hit by a car, right? That's a really healthy kind of space to be in. So if you're a little bit anxious about death and dying, you might do some things like do your self checks and take yourself to your medical appointments and do some of that preventative care. But anxiety turned up too loud can be unhealthy, unhelpful, or maybe it's even based in inaccurate information. So for some of some of us that are older with SB, we might have grown up learning SB was a pediatric condition, that we were at some point going to die early and young due to SB related things. We now know that that's inaccurate information. But inaccurate information that's been ingrained in us as the thing and the truth can be really hard to pinpoint and even more difficult to challenge sometimes. So making sure you have accurate information, making sure you're looking at today's research and not research from 20, 30 years ago. Also, looking at what you have control over and what you don't. I don't have control of when I'm going to die. I might take my dogs for a walk this evening and be hit by a car and never be able to do anything again, right? Like pretty morbid. But I also might live until I'm 60, 70, or 80. And so what do I have control over? Well, I can make sure I'm checking both ways before I cross the street tonight when I walk my dogs, and that might be really helpful. With my SB, I've already mentioned some of this, but I can do my self-checks. I can't feel my feet, and sometimes when I wear new fancy fun shoes, they cause problems. So if I'm wearing a fun fancy new pair of shoes, I'm going to check my feet that night. I'm going to make sure I get to the doctor. I'm going to do my annual checkups. And if it seems that I should go to a urologist or a neurologist or a nephrologist or fill in the blank ologist, I'm going to make sure I follow up. With other things, I'm going to check myself. I'm a lifelong believer in mental health therapy and checking in with the mental health aspect. Depression and anxiety rates tend to be higher in populations with disability, SB included. And it's great to go and have that checked out and have some extra tools for that. Then the things that I don't have control over. I don't always have control over when I get a UTI. I don't always have control of when I have a pressure point. I might have a new pressure sore developing. I don't have control of when my shunt decides to work and when my shunt doesn't decide to work. But I can control how I respond to that. So again, getting immediate care. If I'm worried enough about something, I'm tempted to post in an online forum, I should probably just go to the urgent care. Or get some help from that person who may be a little bit more medically trained than I am. It's okay to get second opinions before you just jump to the urgent care. I I keep jumping on this social media thing because I am in several Spina Bifida related social media groups or other disability related groups, and I see a great number of medical questions posted there. So I do address that. And trying to let go of the things that are out of my control while focusing on the things that are not. That's a hard one, and that one can sometimes be helpful to have some therapy around. How do I let go of things that I don't control? And what does that even mean when I'm not tangibly holding on to anything in my hands?
And even if you don't have physical control over something, you can still have psychological or emotional control. So taking an inventory of the stuff that is outside of my immediate physical influence and control, and then saying, okay, well, how can I cope with this emotionally? What is the story I want to tell myself about this situation that will help me get through it in the healthiest way possible? Do I want to believe that the glass is half full or half empty? What serves me, given that the glass is just the glass? And uh, who can I solicit to support me? Who and what are my resources, both internal and external? And I think the ultimate objective is to be proactive and smart, but not let our anxieties and fears interfere with our living, because that will cause the greatest regret. So, going back to Elizabeth's example of, it's perfectly reasonable, practical, and doable to look both ways before crossing the street, and that's just basic safety. And you're not going to have a very good life if you stay in your house because you're terrified of being hit by a car. So it's about, I think, recognizing a reasonable amount of risk, assessing that risk, and deciding what can reasonably be done about it. So, what else can you do to make the most of your life in the here and now? Well, you can enjoy time with the people you care about and who care about you, and let them know that you appreciate them. I make a point to let my family especially know how much I love and appreciate them. And I work really hard to not leave or let them leave on a sour note or after a fight. So I try really hard that if one of us is going out, that we reconcile in some way or come to a stalemate, because you never know what could happen. And just, I think we have a tendency to think that it's always going to be that the way it is now, whether good or bad. And change is inevitable. So recognizing that change is coming, that includes death, that includes different life transitions, and saying, I'm going to appreciate the good things and the good people as they are right now, and recognize that they may not always be here, and that makes them all the more precious and sweet. And to quote Avenue Q, it's only for now, and that includes the bad stuff too. So I think meditating on that can imbue us with hope at the toughest of times as well. Many people find it helpful to keep a gratitude journal, and this allows them to take each day, take a little bit of time to appreciate the moments, the people, and the things in their life that make it precious and worthwhile and that are going well, especially when we have chronic illnesses and health issues. I think we will often attend to those problems and fixate on them. So even taking some time to say, wow, 3 cheers for the bodily systems that I'm taking for granted because they are doing their job. I am not upset about my nose because my nose is working. I am not upset about my ears because my ears are working. I think that can make a difference for a lot of people. And there is some interesting research that shows that gratitude journals are more effective or powerful for some types of people than others. But without going down that rabbit hole, I'd say give it a try and see if it's good for you.
I get a
Uh,
lot of people who roll their eyes at me when I say make a list of the things you're grateful for every day. But the truth is our brains from way back when are hardwired to really be more focused and remember better the bad things. And that was because it was a safety mechanism. If I remembered what berry kept me from dying and not to eat the poisonous berries, then I was more apt to live. We are still hardwired that way to some extent. And so it is really for every like 3 bad things you remember, we tend to remember 1 good thing. So a gratitude journal or a gratitude list is a way of forcing ourselves to spend more time remembering about the things that are working in our life. And like Karlin was saying, it could be the really simple things like I woke up this morning. Um,
Huzzah!
which is sometimes something to really celebrate, right? There are moments in life where we don't always think we will wake up in the morning or we will be able to go on. Yet here we are today. And it could be something more detailed or more unique or special to that day, but it can be a game changer.
And like I said before, I really like to emphasize that it's about the stories we tell ourselves of reality is just reality. Reality is, we perceive it through a glass darkly. It's fundamentally neutral. So the story we ultimately decide to tell ourselves can make a huge amount of difference. The glass is the glass, but am I going to decide that the glass is half full or half empty or something else? So something else that you can do is write your own obituary and your own epitaph as a way of considering the legacy or the impact you'd like to leave on the world and how you'd like to be remembered. I think this can be excellent for contemplation and also motivation. So if you notice that something is falling short or regrets are popping up as you're writing your obit, saying, oh, maybe I want to start telling myself a new story or writing my story differently in the here and now while I still have time. Something that I emphasize a lot, uh, and do as I say, not as I do, because I have to also whip myself on this thing, is we tend to regret the things we didn't do more than we tend to regret the things we did. We allow ourselves to get so bollocksed up over the possibility of failure or embarrassment or what if it doesn't go well. And when you talk to people at the end of their lives, very rarely do people fixate on, wow, I'm so glad I didn't go to the Sadie Hawkins dance because I know I would have embarrassed myself and that bullet was dodged. What people tend to say is, I wonder what might have happened if I'd gone to the Sadie Hawkins dance as a teenager with the person who asked me out and hadn't been afraid to do that. So seize the day, uh, feel the fear and do it anyway, and push yourself safely and pro-socially outside of your own comfort zone. Look for opportunities to try new things. Look for opportunities to express yourself. And even look for tiny ways to shake up your everyday routine to make the day special. So
These
these
next slides we're gonna buzz
we're
through
going to
because we
buzz
want
through,
to have
but the
time for questions and the answers. So feel free to pop your questions in the chat or the Q&A box. Juanita and I are monitoring them. We don't need to buzz through that quickly, Karlin.
okay.
Why don't you go back to the beginning of the nonfiction and we'll just kind of go over a few of the things that are here. So here's some works about nonfiction works, excuse me, about life, death, and bereavement. I am not sure I have personally read any of these. I think there's 3 slides worth. Are there any you would like to highlight, Karlin?
So it's interesting I sort of, this is not meant to be a comprehensive list, and your mileage may certainly differ, and especially as we get into the fiction, your tastes may differ. I sort of struggled to find resources that were specifically geared towards contemplating death when you have a chronic ailment. I think that's a too small genre that could stand to be bigger, but these might get you on the path to contemplating your life, your death, processing grief, processing your grief about other people's deaths or the deaths of pets, coming to terms with maybe the meaning of that. One thing that I did appreciate and enjoy is Rick Ritter's Coping with Physical Loss and Disability workbook. I think that it's more geared towards people with acquired disabilities, but I think if you browse through, there are maybe a few questions in there that can be useful for processing disability and the impact that it's had on your life, good and bad. So
So I
here's
put this
more.
in the chat, but I will say it out loud as well as Karlin is scrolling through these resources. You're going to get a copy of this recording, and I think we're also going to do some copying and pasting and make a resource list that can be sent out as well. So you do not need to write all of this stuff down right now.
And I'm going to highlight another one that I particularly like. Atul Gawande is a doctor, and he is a absolutely stellar writer, beautiful. And he's written a number of books on different topics. So I highly recommend Being Mortal, Illness, Medicine, and What Matters in the End. Fantastic read, brilliant writer.
Okay, so these
Then,
next are fiction books. And don't worry, if you're not a reader, we do have films and other modalities coming up. So there is more than just books on our resource list.
and here's films.
Films. Oh, I like the movie Up. That was Finding Nemo. Yes, that's a great one on death and dying, actually.
Yeah, all of these were compiled by me because I'm a bibliophile and a cinemaphile. So all of these are, I think, some of my favorites in processing death and illness and grief and life and the meaning of life.
Oh, the bucket list was a good one.
Ugh, I repeat
Oh, I
it
love
up.
Lars and the Real Girl too.
Oh, yeah, that is probably one of my favorite rom-coms. So yes, we both endorse Lars and the Real Girl. Here's some TED Talks related to grief and presentations.
TED Talks are always really good. Yeah,
And
good
here's
picks
some
on
music. Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm just going with it. Yeah, good picks.
Yeah, so your mileage and genre choices may certainly differ. So this is not meant to be a comprehensive or definitive list. These are just a few things that I enjoy or thought that y'all might enjoy. I'm a Beatles fanatic, disclaimer. Everywhere at the End of Time is I think, challenging but really interesting listen that is meant to simulate the experience of having Alzheimer's. And it's several hours long as an album, so you really have to buckle in or be prepared for a full intense listening experience. But that's a very interesting one that not a lot of people know about. And I have a gallows sense of humor, so some of these are sort of quirky or funny or are meant to sort of shrug about that life is tough and then we die, and there's humor to be found in that. But there's also beauty to be found. So I always tear up at listening at What a Wonderful World by Louis Armstrong. You also notice that many of the titles of slides in this presentation were named after death-related songs. And here is our bibliography.
Yeah, and before we move all the way into that, if as you're exploring your anxieties around death and dying, and you're realizing maybe in thinking about it or talking about it, that you're having lots of feelings and having troubles with those. But I really like the movie Inside Out, and Inside Out 2,
Yes.
which will be coming soon. If it's to streaming, if it's out in the theater right now. I use that one a lot. I just used it recently to help talk to my nieces about emotions. It really does a great job of naming different feelings and what may cause those different feelings and what memories might be associated with those things. So not specific to death and dying, but I kind of wanted to throw it out there since it's kind of out in pop culture right now anyway.
That is a great suggestion, and it does help to explore and process the different facets of our experiences and
Mhm.
our reactions to them.
Yeah.
And I'm a Pixar fanatic, so great recommendation.
So we won't bore you with all the details of the bibliography, but we do have a few minutes left for question and answer. I don't see anything posted in the question and answer. I have seen some wonderful things in the chat about the longevity of this group. Thank you for sharing that. I am 40 something, and it's just great to know that there are people ahead of me doing the SB thing at 60 and 70. People,
Lincoln
y'all seem to
Park,
really like
yeah.
the resources and the music. Um, any questions for myself or Karlin? Ooh, I don't know what you mean by health passports, Catherine.
Our health passports, by a health passport, and this is Juanita, the voice out of the blue. Are they sort of like a record, like a handy record, of your, procedures, conditions, et cetera?
I believe so.
Mm.
I don't want to give a definitive yes, but I think that does sound familiar.
And I
So
can look that up, Catherine, and sort of see if we can help answer that. But there's another question from Kathleen saying my son was told years ago at a SB function that he would not live to an old age. He is now 22 and does not believe mom that he can live to an old age. Where can I point him to more current information?
attend some of these groups. And there's tomorrow there's a community information session on urinary tract in adults, or excuse me, urinary incontinence for adults. I think a lot of the SB stuff that we put out, or not we, but Juanita and Judy put out, are great resources. There are your state specific groups. I think for me, the biggest thing is about connecting with people who have been there, done that. So I do have a few friends who are a decade or more older than me, with Spina Bifida, and I love them for their wisdom and for their reassurance about those kinds of things. That has all been really helpful.
And I think the proof is in the pudding of I am 40, and how old are you?
You're gonna put me on the spot. I am almost 45.
And we know tons of SB peeps who are even older than that. So
Mhm.
I think
So,
reaching out and participating in the community and learning that we're out there and we're leading rich, full lives, but it
mhm.
does take the courage to live.
Yeah. And double check the chat. There's some 60s and 70s. There's quite a few people. People got really into putting their ages in there. I want to quickly address the health passport thing. If that's about keeping track of your medical record, I have an old school Word document with all my different procedures spelled out that my mother started years and years and years ago, that I now try to update. The other piece with this is a lot of folks use MyChart these days. So a lot of the big electronic medical records use Epic, and Epic can be connected between hospitals. So I have my MyChart account connected with my primary care and several of the other hospitals or other clinics that I go to for specialty care. So they could all see my chart. I can also get into my chart and make sure it's updated and correct and ask questions and ask for edits if it isn't. And then we have another question in here about how we both handle stress around death and dying, and how we got into the field. Do you want to take that first, Karlin, or do you want me to take it?
Oh, I can take it.
Cool.
So I'm a clinical psychologist, so or actually, well, we're both clinical psychologists. So we're both in the mental health field. Uh, that's a long, complicated question. I think we were both just interested in psychology, and I think my physical disability wasn't as much of a difficulty for me as some of my neurological stuff that created obstacles along my path. So it certainly wasn't easy, but I was motivated to get there. And I think, how are you treated in the field? I would say, I think I'm treated fairly well. Uh, I mean, I think I might superficially come off as sort of a goofball, but when I buckle down, I like to think that I demonstrate that I know my stuff and that I'm skilled with the populations that I work with, and that I know the areas that I have personally researched and worked in. And
Yeah.
how do I handle stress around death and dying? Oh, well, probably not well at 3 a.m. But that's probably not the optimal time for any of us to start contemplating these things. I think I just try to live my life as best I can, manage threats and risks to the best of my ability, uh, cherish my relationships, and think about the legacy or the impact that I want to have. And I can't promise that I'm perfect at it, but being cognizant of my fears and mounting regrets and anything that I'm trying to avoid, and trying to be more courageous in how I confront those things, because they can potentially teach you a lot. And it's the
Mm.
skeletons in the closet can get you. So I can't promise that I'm perfect, but trying to be courageous in confronting the skeletons in the closet, whatever they may be.
Yeah.
What's
And for me,
what's Elizabeth's take?
yeah, for me, the death and dying, I don't ever remember having a great amount of stress around death and dying. I have a faith base that has a lot of thoughts and beliefs and things around that and provides some reassurance. I also, when grandparents started dying in the 90s and great grandparents started dying for me in the 90s, my family started talking about that stuff more. And I've had parents now with chronic illness as well as grandparents with chronic terminal illness. And so it's a topic that comes up a lot in my family, and we have gotten into a space where we talk about it. My brother and my sister are also in the healthcare profession. And so it's a thing that we all are very aware of and talk about. So, and how did I get into this field? I have always been a person that, even with my disability, I did sports, I had jobs, I drove cars, I did things that didn't fit the stereotype of disability. So I've always kind of worked in the disability field. I started in adaptive recreation, moved over into therapeutic recreation, and moved there into the mental health counseling, and then up into the world of psychology, because I am a nerd and am like fascinated by how humans work and how we're wired. That is me in a nutshell. I can answer more questions on a personal level if people have um, curiosities or want to know more about how I did it or what it took. There's definitely a lot of ableism that is alive and well in our field. However, there's also a space for us, and I feel very much a part of the field, and I am treated very well, relatively well. We have a question in the chat here. I personally have not been able to find adult providers particularly familiar with SB. We don't have an adult clinic in my area. So I end up feeling my care together based on whether or not I feel heard and listened to when I go to different specialists. If I don't feel heard and listened to, I don't go back. And if I feel heard and listened to, I continue to go.
There's a question here, Elizabeth, that I think is echoed by many people. Any advice for dealing with the deaths of our friends and community members?
Ooh, I missed that
Well,
one.
they
It
could
must have been a
seek out
private
our
message.
grief panel that we did previously on that exact topic.
Mm-hmm. I think grief and loss is something we probably don't have time to fully delve into today, but it is absolutely expected when people or pets or die, or even when people or important things change and move. You can have grief and loss over a change that you even initiated, maybe a new job or a new living situation. I think grief can be confusing and surprising because it hits us in waves and it hits different people in different ways. And so, yeah, I mean, if grief and loss is an area you're struggling in, I would also refer you back to the grief presentation. And if it seems to be lasting longer than it feels it, quote, should, whatever that means to you, I would suggest finding counseling, or if you have a faith base and you can meet with a religious leader in that faith base to get some spiritual support, that could also be helpful. Thank you,
Yeah,
Juanita,
and
for
I
that.
think realizing that this is something that we all share, I mean, it doesn't just magically make it better, but at least recognizing lots of people have died in the history of the cosmos. So I am not, unless technology really advances or we can upload me into the cloud, I am not going to be the exception. So there's a strange kind of comfort in the experiences that we all share as a species, and that includes grief of other people have coped with incredible, profound losses and they've gotten through them. So I think I fear my parents' deaths more than I fear my own death at this juncture. And so I have to self-soothe by reminding myself that I've appreciated the time with them, that I've tried to make the most of that, and that other people who have lost their nearest and dearest have ultimately gotten through that and come out the other side, not unscathed, but at least resilient. So I have hope that someday I will be able to get through that grief as well. Ooh, this is a good question. Is there any benefit to having an autopsy?
I mean, there are some cases where autopsy is kind of a mandatory thing, and that's going to happen whether or not you really want one, unless you have a specific religious reason to not have one. I mean, I think sometimes it's a purely personal um a, a purely personal decision. If you are doing some of the legal documents though, and you want to be like, quote, donated to research because you're really committed to SB and helping people understand how people with SB live and die and other things, you could probably have your body and the results of the autopsy donated to science. I'm not 100% how sure to do that, but I think you could probably do it. Oh yeah, look at that. Lori put that there too. I am not
Yeah,
100% sure how to do that, but I think
I'll
you
jump
could.
in super quickly for that. And I think it just depends. So I would just do the Google and just maybe, look up, like a donation, like donate my body like near me. And then a lot of times, depending where you live, something will pop up with a university or like another research institution. And then each one has like slightly different rules about how to do that. But one of the big things is that you need to do it while you're alive. And I know that sounds weird, but because of course you would need to set that up. But sometimes I've had calls from people who are doing it for family members who requested it, but they themselves never had it set up. So you have to, you have to do it yourself for the most part, I think. So like do that, background info, research now. And if you have any questions, I'll put and thank you. My email's right there. If you have any questions about that. I also saw a couple of medical questions related to shunts and renal failure. Again, please go ahead and write to me. But really, the medical questions really should go to your healthcare provider. And just, if they haven't answered that question, those medical questions, please, maybe call them back, try to see if you can speak to the nurse that's on hand at the doctor's office, and I can help you as much as possible as well in guiding you on that. And again, my email address is there. So it's 8:01 or Eastern time. So we've finished, but does anybody have a burning question? Are we, otherwise I think we're done with the session. And just want to thank you, everybody. Your comments really made this, and your chat and your questions made this a very rich session. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thanks so much, Karlin, as always.
Thank you.
Yeah, you were both awesome as always. So we really appreciate it. And Doreen, I see that you had questions, so please go ahead and email them to me, and then I will make sure to send it to Elizabeth and to Karlin. I think Elizabeth also put her address in the
Email
chat.
and my Voices of Disability book project are both in the chat.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you so much then again, and have a good rest of your day. And we hope we will see you in another session.